Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Pakistan EdTech Summit once again. This is going to be another fruitful panel discussion, and I'm going to be the moderator for this one. Let me take the liberty to do so. We've got a very esteemed panel, but before I introduce them, let me tell you a little about the topic today. So collaborations have been between universities and industry have given life to many blockbuster discoveries over the years. There are shining examples of fruitful collaboration between universities, industry partners, and startups. Many ideas from research and universities are put to use through collaboration between universities, schools, colleges, and firms. Others reach the market through licensing or startup companies, endeavors to find solutions to complex environmental and economic challenges, for example, in energy, environment, health, or security, have increasingly required collaboration between universities and industry because few organizations have the internal capacity to deliver results on their own. And even if they do so, they're probably not at par with the disruption, innovation, and internationalization that is the need of the hour, especially post-pandemic. For this purpose, one of the key areas that we needed to focus on with this EdTech Summit was the need for industry-academia linkages. Now, when we talk about industry-academia linkages, we wanted to give you a perspective from the corporate side because we have been hearing from a lot of educators, right? So today, well, we've got some industry experts who have joined us. So starting with, and since we're all here today, let's start with the lady who's here. Miss Alia Zafar, she's the group head HR at the Bank of Pakistan, at the Bank of Punjab. Puruesh Chaudhry, who's going to be joining us shortly. She's the founder and president at Agahi. Mr. Azhar Nawaz, the chief information officer at Engro. And Mr. Zouhair Khaliq, who is himself an institution. He's the member of the Prime Minister's task force on IT and telecom. Thank you so much for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate the time and effort. Now, when we talk about industry-academia linkages, right, let me begin by speaking about, according to a recent survey conducted by the Express Tribune, now Pakistan ranks at number 125 among 132 countries in terms of budgetary allocation for higher education. Don't you think the lack of budgetary resources widens this gap between industry and academia? Starting with Mr. Zouhair Khaliq, if you could please shed some light.
So my view on that, Anza, is that yes, certainly you need the linkages. That goes without saying. But I'd take a little bit of a controversial point here, which is that we tend to focus too much on higher education without worrying about the very basics of education that we are currently funding some people in the country. When you look at those syllabus that we have, the way we structured it, we're just not getting to where the 21st century requires us to be at this point in time. We're not training our young people, our children, to grow up to be people who can ask questions, who can seek modes of inquiry. We're still in the process of rote learning, mostly at schools across the country, whether it's private or public schools. And also, as they come up to higher education, they come up to college stage and so on. We are not really bringing in the kind of 21st century attitude in education, which is all about science and technology and like everybody else, it's something that is happening on a daily basis. Just in the intro earlier, you mentioned yourself as a digital native. Now we're doing that by default and not by education. And to me, that becomes the real focus for me. And that's where, to me, where industry and education, the whole linkage has to start. I was recently at one of the universities in Islamabad about 6 months ago, where I was invited actually by the dean of the university, and there were perhaps about 12 or 15 PhD people sitting around the table. No doubt all of them extremely brilliant, extremely well educated. But their dilemma, and the one they posed to me, was how do we make ourselves relevant to industry out there? And my feedback to them was that, have you ever stepped outside your college and gone and talked to anybody out there? And there was a dumbstruck look on faces because they hadn't. Uh, and that is the fact of the matter, they had not. And they said, what's that got to do with it? We write papers, we do research, we do so much, in the sciences and so on. And I said, well, where does any of it fit into, let's say, providing better agricultural technology or better e-learning or better medicine or any of that? Do you know what is actually required on the ground as the papers we write? And the answer briefly to me was that, well, the papers we write earn us the scores and the recognition so we get to our PhDs. And so the objective to me was completely out of sync with what we're trying to discuss here. I'm going to leave that as controversial talking to you, and hopefully we can proceed on other more discussions.
Right. And speaking of that controversial thought, let's go to Alia, Zafar. What do you have to say about these profound thoughts that have been shared by Mr. Zouhair Khaliq?
I would, whatever I could hear, because I could hear him very clearly, but I think what I caught, I would definitely agree with that. And I'll give you a few reasons and rationale in terms of how I see the industry and academia relationship, so to say. So you have the land and you have the sea. It's very much like that. So there's supposed to be harmony, and they are supposed to complement each other. But both environments are completely different. So when we look at both environments, their requirements are completely different. So when you talk about academia, they are essentially looking at long-term goals. They are looking at recognition. They are looking at, especially peer recognition, I would say. They are not really looking at the knowledge part of it, which transfers into money. So essentially, when we talk about research essentially is the transfer of money into knowledge, which is the first part that you were talking about. And that's where we have, of course, a problem because we don't have enough funding. And that's where, again, collaborations are required. And the second part of it, of course, which is extremely important for the industry, is how that innovation is the transfer of knowledge into money, and how that knowledge and research essentially links with the innovation part of that knowledge and eventually goes into impact for the industry. Because what is industry looking for? We are looking for short-term gains. We are looking for survival. We are looking at competition. We are looking at costs. So for us, these components are extremely important. And the industry has to look at those, and the academia is looking in a different direction. So if we want to come together, the research has to really transform into innovation, so that innovation essentially links with the industry and brings money to the industry, and that essentially means economic growth. So that's how I see it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And speaking of industry expectations, now here's some of the expectations, as Ma'am Alia said, and also from what we have from our knowledge base. They're looking for developed skilled manpower, solutions for their concerns. They have an operational approach. They're looking for, like you said, value for money, is strictly speaking in layman terms. Mr. Azhar Nawaz, what would your take be on this industry expectations?
So before I go there, I would like to address your first question around the allocation of budget. If we are, if our academia and universities are only looking for allocation of budget from one side, which is what is the allocation of budget from the government, that is where the problem lies. You need to increase the avenues where you can get the budget from. So I'll just give you one example. I used to work at Imperial College London. So I just before this session, I just looked at their numbers. So for last year, their funding was around 1,026 million pounds, and out of that, only a third from the tuition fees. Rest of the funding was from different sources, and out of that, around 350 million pounds was from the research. that was all research funding from the industry and some research funding from the charities and from others. So universities need to look at create more avenues where they can get the funding from. So the budget allocation from government can be one source, but then you need to look at budget sources and funding from other sources. So
And what
while
about the expectations from the industry?
yeah, if you look at where we are in Pakistan, the environment, the current environment where we are living in, the issue is that industry expects the first and foremost thing is that industry expect knowledgeable and quality output, quality graduates coming out of the university, and the people who are coming out of universities with the knowledge which can help industries move forward. I totally agree with what Alia was saying, that the industry, there's competition, there's cost issues, there's a survival issue. Industry wants to survive, and industry have short-term objectives to meet the objectives and earn the revenues. However, when the people coming from academia, they have a different mindset. So until and unless we bridge this gap, we increase communication, we bridge the gap and bring industry and academia together. The important point is that industry in Pakistan is mostly working on Me Too production. So whatever is happening around the world, we just copy and we start producing that. Where's the innovation? So the innovation will only come from this collaboration, this synergy. When we develop synergy between academia and industry, Alia has pointed out that if you put money into research, you'll come up with knowledge, and then that knowledge can then transform and become innovation, and then that innovation can help in industry in terms of creating more money. So in terms of creating that knowledge, moving towards commercialization.
Right, absolutely. Puruesh, Chaudhry, thank you so much for joining us, even though you came a bit late. But here's an interesting take. Now, I was reading this article where Martha Craig, the Vice Principal of Research and Innovation at the McGill University in Canada, said, and this is a problem that most of us have seen. So whenever we talk about industry academia linkages, mostly the first thing that comes to mind, especially in our part of the world, is okay, BBA, MBA graduates being linked up with the telcos, FMCGs, or MNCs. But here's what Ms. Crago said. She said that the social sciences have a dual role to play. There are researchers whose work becomes the basis of innovative products, processes, or services. And these are often not commercialized due to a lack of familiarity or culture for doing so. But their work can be societally very impactful. What do you have to say about this from the perspective of industry academia linkages?
Thanks, Anza. Pardon for being late. I thought the call was at 3, so that was confusing. But nevertheless, to your point about the article that you mentioned, I've not read the article myself, but from what in essence, what I hear from you is the fact that how are social sciences or social scientists picking up much more role in terms of defining the innovation in more advanced countries. Much of this is happening is because of the fourth industrial revolution, where you're directly engaging with the societies. So if you tend to think that your product value is for the consumer, we have to think about who is the direct beneficiary. And as and how marketing and advertising and all these placement opportunity changes, the consumer behavior needs to be understood. And for that purpose, we need social scientists, we need historians, we need anthropologists in terms of our thinking in research and innovation. So perhaps from what I sense, this is where she was coming from. But in terms of where Pakistan is, we've become so technical in our ways that we think that the ways and in manner in which we can fix economy, we can fix industries is through applying the engineering, the medical. So we're very typical in our approach.
Right. So
we want to talk about innovation, but we don't want to change the way we think. So innovation typically requires a very different mindset. And so howsoever you want to talk about digital economy or digital footprint, How are you going to do that? And for what purposes will you do that? So do you see your entire market segmentation, or do you see your entire economy moving in that direction? And if so, what happens to the rest of the industries? You have the agriculture, you have the cotton, you have all these different types that actually contribute to the GDP. So in terms of investment in research, we have to look in the context of what is that value that they're adding towards the GDP. It's a much more tedious task, and very little work has been done on this. So research and innovation in terms of growth factor, we need to really come up with a number as to how they're contributing towards the growth of the GDP.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that very valid point, Puruesh. And Zouhair Saab, my question to you is that since Puruesh just shed light on the fact that we're not looking at a lot of other areas that comprise of the academia. So we have people coming out of technical universities, sure, but what about the agricultural universities, or what about social science schools? What are we doing for them? And what is the single common denominator, the challenge that we're facing, like what we haven't been able to do right in Pakistan and other South Asian countries? So unmute yourself, please.
I hopefully my mic works better this time around. So I'm going to try and answer that in a couple of things, because I'm thinking of so many other dimensions here as well. Absolutely valid points. You know, the thing that we are, as I said in the earlier remarks, we're not focused on linking what we learn at college or university with what is actually required on the ground. In today's world, with 220 million odd people in this country, we should be heavily focused on the technology as a solution to a lot of this stuff. And I mentioned in the earlier comments, you know, whether it's the agricultural sector, whether it's the health sector, or it's education, and so many other sectors, we need to address them with technology. Now, to Puresh's point, it needs techie people. And we have a lot of techie people, but we just haven't linked them back to what is actually required on the ground. But let me try and broaden this discussion to something. When I was growing up, when I came back to this country, having just qualified, long time ago now, 37 years nearly, and I joined a company called ICI Pakistan. Around me in Karachi at the time were places like Citibank and Bank of America and Unilever and Procter & Gamble and so many of these FMCGs. And I mean, telcos didn't exist at the time, to be honest. The focus there was to hire good people with a degree, and then to teach them soft skills as well. And that was the focus of the industry. They did not focus on schools and colleges delivering them people who could work with them. So typically Citibank, for example, would hire young people as what they called in those days ETs, which was executive trainees. At ICI, we had management trainees, MTs. And what they did with them is to then send them on a course where they would learn the soft skills of how to manage people, how to interact with people, how to, write a report, for example, and so on. And they all went through that process, and there was a huge investment. I worked for ICI for 7.5 years. And I can tell you they spent a few $100,000 in today's value on just training me at the time. Okay. Now, when I look around me, all my colleagues of that time, and the ones who were obviously much younger, are almost all of them in C-level positions across the board, or they're doing some wonderful innovation stuff themselves. Why? Because they got not only the education part of it, but they got the industry to invest in them. Okay. Today, my biggest question to industry: what do you invest in your people? I know when I look around, almost nothing. When we relaunched MobileInc in 2003, the biggest focus that I had at the time was to train people and train the hell out of them. Okay, so we brought in not only local trainers, we brought in people from MIT and Harvard and so on, not to teach them technical skills, but to teach them the soft skills about thinking and innovation in interacting with the rest of the world and those kind of things. And again, if you look at those, that gave birth to so many people who are in telcos today in C-level position, not only in Pakistan, but across the region, even in the United Kingdom and so on. So what we need to do also is question the other side of it. Is industry doing enough to create the people that they want? That's my question to the other side of it, because I kind of sit neutral at this point in time, and so I can afford the luxury of challenging both sides. We at the National Incubation Center, what we do is we again take young techie people and we incubate them for a year. And guess what we teach them? We don't teach them technical education at all. We teach them how to build a business, how to build a product, how to take that product to market. So to have this expectation that somehow a college or a university will somehow produce somebody who will immediately be relevant to what you want them to do is, I think, hugely unfair to those people and to yourselves as industry, I would argue. You need to be able to have that two-way linkage. Again, at Mobilink, for example, we used to go to all the top universities every year and look at the graduates of the people who were about to graduate and then offer them jobs to join the company, knowing full well that once they did join, they would have actually no relevant skills in what we wanted them to do. All we were looking at were good, bright people who had worked hard and who could then be taken to the next stage. So when we talk about these linkages, we've got to have them two-way. All the discussions I see at the moment happening are somehow this very unrealistic and unfair expectation that it's only the education part which will feed somehow to the industry people who will be hitting the ground running. And that's not a very fair expectation, in my opinion.
So you've really, given us some food for thought. But speaking about the expectations of the industry and how they work on linkages, Mr. Azhar Nawaz, Engro happens to be one of the most sought after places to work at. However, what we've noticed is that, a lot of times you're only picking out students from the IBAs or the LUMs or so on, students from abroad. What is the industry doing? Is it not being non-inclusive in terms of accepting students from elsewhere as well? Because a lot of times, and we keep interacting with a lot of young students as well, say someone who's from some other university, and they keep saying, so either is it a lack of skills, or are those students not good enough? Where is the industry and academia seeing the lack there? What does the academia or the students therefore need to do more?
So Anza, thank you for this question. I mean, I've been looking at people for last 18 months, looking to hire people and make a team in terms of making a technology team to take digital innovation forward within the company. So I've been looking at hiring people from across the board, from different institutes, and my focus is on diversity in terms of background, in terms of institutions where people are coming from. But I mean, across the board, there is an issue of lack of quality. The people who are coming out of the academia, I think academia needs to focus more on in terms of quality.
But like when we speak about post-pandemic, sorry to cut you off there, but when we're speaking like post-pandemic, what about all those people or those areas? Now, a lot of information is available online. Would you treat someone who is a graduate of the Harvard online MBA program, or someone who's learned coding from Udemy with the same, at the same level?
How we hire people is that we have a job description and we have certain skills we need. And if someone can come in and prove that they have that skill level, maybe up to 70% or 65% or 80% of those skills, we don't see which school they graduated from. They can come on board and we can bring them. So another point, as Zouhair was mentioning that we in an industry do also have a responsibility. We need to go and create linkages with academia. I think people who are in this room have also got a responsibility. I should go and talk to students and tell them what our expectations are in industry, so they can start working on those things. Also, people from industry needs to go and create these research centers in universities. Industry needs to fund them and create these research, not only research by the student, but as I gave another example of Imperial before, in Imperial College, there are more researchers, if you compare them to the number of students. So those researchers, their dedicated job is to do research on industrial problems, because industry is funding them. They do research and innovation on the industrial problems and then come up with solutions. Now, I understand innovation is difficult and is not always, all innovative solutions cannot be successful straight away. So there will be failures, but the innovation is something which keeps the industry moving forward. As Puruesh was mentioning around the growth, if you look at US only, for the last 10 years, half of the contribution towards US growth is by the industry, which never existed 10 years before. So innovation is key for growth of any country.
Right, absolutely agreed. Ms. Alia, Zafar, post-pandemic, there has been a lot of changes. A lot of jobs have become obsolete as well, because a lot of work has become online. What do you think is the future of jobs post-pandemic?
I think there are 2-3 areas that we need to understand. First, of course, there's going to be a slowdown overall in our economy. We haven't seen much of it yet, but you will see the impact as we go forward in the coming year. Having said that, the change that is coming in is something that we need to understand in terms of especially people. And the first thing, of course, is that a lot of it now, perforce, is going digital. So technology becomes one of the key areas that we link with. And I would like to connect this with Azhar and Zouhair's earlier responses in terms of how we as an industry in banking, people, and also with the skills and upskilling, and how we are taking them on board and how we are also developing them. So taking from Zouhair's perspective, I think as an industry, we are investing heavily in people, and that investment includes soft skills. That essentially means investing in one person, and if I look at per person cost, it's certainly much more than probably a lot of industries are spending on people. Having the best possible options for the people, but now we have a challenge, of course, that the in-person trainings and development and capacity building components cannot be there to the extent they were earlier. So that means e-learning has taken a huge jump forward, and a lot of organizations have had to learn that component very quickly. We had already started that course. So you take a leap ahead from that perspective. In terms of job, there is a lot of change coming in the next 5 to 10 years. A lot of it relates to analytics, of course. It relates a lot to AI. It relates to coding. It relates in every area with data mining. I think all the industries, including the agriculture, as we were talking about earlier, already has these components in it, and there is advancement already there. So all the areas, when you pick them up, you realize that technology is already pretty much there. How we are utilizing and how we are connecting is where we actually need to come together. So for example, at BOP, we have had some MOUs, and we've started working with technology startups, especially women entrepreneurships, coming into technology, giving them seed money, having these kind of interlinkages, actually funding research projects which are linked with what we require as well, looking at our digital landscape and where we are going. So all these components really need to come together. And as we look at it from the industry perspective, the industry has to reach out to the academia. And this is what we've been doing at BUP, by the way. We have been sort of linking with a number of universities, not just the top tier, the second tier as well. And really also with a lot of technology and a lot of skill development component which we are going forward for. So we don't look only at those students who have a bachelor's or a BBA or an MBA or a PhD. We are looking at very young, huge population who are getting into a skill base and acquiring skills. And these can be small technical skills, and how we can connect with that as well and bring all of them into linkages with the industry again, so that they can become better entrepreneurs, even smaller ones. Also funding them, essentially providing them loans, as you know, Kamyab Jawan is linked with that. So all these components need to work together. And if they work together, it can create a very cohesive, I think, push forward for the economy and for the youth of the country.
Right. Thank you very much for that very insightful take on the question. Puruesh, when we talk about capacity building of the students in the academia, right, but what kind of capacity are we building? We have spoken about soft skills, but we know this, that ever since the pandemic came, the culture in workplaces has been changed. So it's no longer called jobs, but more like work, flexi working hours. The whole culture has changed. People are no longer wearing ties to their face, they're logging in from their computers. Now, whether we like it or not, the future is here and the future is now. What do you have to say about bridging the industry academia gap and now really embracing the changed products of the academia that we're going to be now experiencing in the workplaces?
Largely speaking, I think when you talk about industry academia linkages, what is lacking currently is we don't have a vision of where we want to see these linkages move in which direction. So if you get the vision in place, I think a lot of things would start to come into focus. In terms of the skills, that is largely, I think the industry is usually far ahead than the academia in terms of understanding what are the skills which are required. And that's where I think the industry can play a much larger role, going to different universities and really training different students. That is perhaps could be one of their CSR aspects also. So for instance, we work with universities all across Pakistan. We work with students, and we also work with the academics at the same time. And what we've learned is that there is, in terms of helping them understand the work that we do, we usually need to train them initially. So if the industry, depending on whichever domain knowledge they're coming from, if the industry can really equip them with the skill set that is required other than the books that they go through, I think that would give them a head start. Another point is when you talk about the post-pandemic world, sadly, we're not there yet, but in terms of how the world is sort of emerging, there are a couple of scenarios that shape up. One scenario is perhaps, the industry has learned nothing along with the government. So you have
controversial words, Puruesh, but then that's the controversial words, Puruesh. But that's the beauty.
We have to wait and see. It's not like it's post-pandemic yet. So there is no learning which has happened. And when there is no learning which has happened, usually if something of this event or development occurs, say in about 6 or 8 years again, we'll still fall back to the old books, not having understood what we've done previously. So that's one aspect of it. And the other is, I believe, the working from home culture is a lot of young people, at least my cousins and their friends that I speak to, they have adapted to this culture. So so how they will actually reorient their ways of going back to work, I mean, that is something which could be challenging for them. But in that very essence, the quickest idea would be like, let's assume if the industries have learned something, so perhaps they can be much more lenient in terms of how they engage or how they view their employees. And perhaps they need to focus on whether or not they want to change the way they look at them. So for instance, rather than calling them employees, or colleagues and work colleagues, you can actually call them something else in terms of, there are so many. So if you look at the whole question that you raised earlier, like how do we not have students from different universities, business graduates, and all that. So we have to look at the company policies, and that's where I think the regulatory has a lot of role to play. Like how much diversity and inclusivity is in the entire governance structure. Now, if that is, so there are multiple tiers in terms of how do you have to approach all these challenges. So there is a role of the regulatory, and perhaps the skilling part can also come through there. And then there is a role of really understanding where the entire industry, like your higher education, is actually moving. So various levels, and post-pandemic would make it slightly more difficult, because if you don't understand what has happened in the last 3 years or 2 years of that entire time, and how much economy you've lost in the process, then perhaps you'll be repeating the same cycle.
Right, absolutely. Zouhair Saab, we spoke about multiple factors here, and also about the changing workplace, the culture. In an interesting report by the World Economic Forum in 2020, the take was that if we are to sustain the economies post-pandemic, especially for the developing countries, then there needs to be multi-stakeholder partnerships. Now, we've seen this in the form of the government taking initiatives in Pakistan. I know you're aware of any of them. But my question is that the government has laid out several policies to strengthen these linkages between the academia and the industries. But is it enough? What role can the academia play, to the industry play, in order to strengthen these partnerships and make them fruitful?
Look, I think, if we completely always rely on regulation and rules and so on, and the government to step forward, do that, we probably one of the only countries in the world who do that, because in the rest of the world, it is the private sector, it is the industry which drives all of this for their own benefit. Okay, and when you look at it in the short term, maybe there's not much you could gain out of it, but in the long term, as I said in my previous remarks, you have a lot to gain from it. So I think this whole issue of something being regulatory and therefore we will do it, again, to me, seems a kind of a moot discussion. To me, the industry has to look at itself long term and say, we are going to invest in people, and again, by the way, one of the reasons I had to shut down my video and my audio for a couple of minutes was that my gardener outside, oblivious to the fact that I'm on this call, started doing this part of the lawn. Now, what it made me think of was that we're not discussing those people who are out there, and to them at this point in time, industry linkages, work from home, all of those things are completely irrelevant. They are doing what they need to do every day to put food on the plate for themselves and their families in the afternoon and the evening. So we have to look at that part of what needs to be done in terms to sustain those people. But what we are talking here mostly is corporations and industry and the government. And what we need to be able to do is, again, at the expense of repeating my remarks, is to say, I believe that the industry, the private sector, and the academia have to take a lead in talking to each other more. As I said, 6 months ago, this university reached out to me, but again, apparently they didn't like what I told them, which was to get out there and start talking to industry, because I never heard from them again, and I haven't seen them do anything about it. Now, no amount of regulatory framework will make them do anything, okay? So it's the willingness to recognize that without the dependence on each other, we will not move forward, I think, is the key to this thing. And it has to be in the hands of leaders. We're talking to some of them right now. And similarly, in academia, we need to be able to reach out to the the deans and the professors and so on, to be able to make them realize that without regulatory frameworks, that it is the need of the hour for them to produce relevant people. Um, Equally, the industry should be spending more time and effort going on. And it's, by the way, no way criticism on Engro or Bank of Punjab. I'm actually on the board of one of the Engro companies, and I know that they're an extremely progressive organization. So I'm talking industry in general, and I'm talking from here to down here. Every segment of the industry has to engage in this somehow. And I think one of the benefits is of forums like this, if we can get this out to more and more people, to maybe start making them think, because I know that it's often not to do with the lack of will, but just getting involved in your day-to-day so much that you're not even thinking beyond, the old English saying that you get lost in the forest for the trees. And that becomes the issue here. And if we can step back for a couple of minutes and think what we will need in 3 years and in 5 years, then we start planning for it now. One of the biggest lessons I ever learned was from a wonderful boss I had many, many years ago in ICI again, who after 2 p.m. in the afternoon, if you entered his office, he would be sitting there with a pad and a pencil and his spectacles and just staring at the wall. And I asked him one day, I said, what are you doing every day? And he said, you guys are doing what you need to do every day because we've had our meetings. I'm now looking at what I need to do next week, next month, next year, and in the next 10 years. And that is a very powerful, for me, that was something that it's lived with me ever since. And I think what is required is for leaders in industry and leaders in academia to be able to step back for a minute from their daily routines and think where we are headed in terms of the future. And we've talked about technology. Yes, of course, we need technology every day, but we also need soft skills from people. The ability to think, the ability to relate to other people, the ability to care for other people. And a lot of that I find missing as we progress and we simply focus on hireable skills, if you will, as opposed to what I think are very necessary human skills every day, and we're not investing enough in that at the moment.
Right, absolutely. And Zouhair, you have, like I said, once again, forced us all to think beyond what is visible to us. Mr. Azhar Nawaz, since Engro is a progressive company at the end of the day, and what all do you look at when you're looking in terms of hiring and looking into multi-stakeholder partnerships? So, right, we need soft skills, we need capacity building. But what are we doing beyond the capacity building of your management trainees or those that you have on job?
So I think there are some very important points which Zouhair has just recently made. So the first and foremost thing I think is the thing which is very important is that industry and academia need to improve the communication, as Zouhair has mentioned, and they need to start understanding each other's problems, right? So once we start understanding each other's problems, then we can move forward in terms of finding solutions to those. Industry, the academia needs to make sure that they start working on producing quality stuff. Quality is something which is lacking in our part of the world. So it's very, very important. I meet a lot of people who come out of academia and you feel that they're really short where they should be. Academia needs to look at what they're teaching, look at their curriculum. I think our academia is behind in terms of, if you compare them with where the academia internationally is, and we are behind in number of years. So we need to catch up there. So they need to come up, bring their game forward, and then to come up with quality. And what industry needs to do is come up with integration with academia, like come up with internship program. Engro is doing one right now in all departments, offering internships for students in all areas for 3 months to try and upskill them. I think there needs to be research programs introduced in our industries, in our universities, and industry needs to fund it. There should be research fellowships. There should be, I think industry should come forward and introduce research awards and things like that. Research funding needs to be increased. We don't have a concept of gap year. So if students can take a gap year and go and work for 1 year in industry and then come back and learn more skills, they'll have more perspective what is needed in the industry, and they can go back and learn from the academia. And people like us and the people in the room needs to go to universities and maybe take guest lectures and maybe have that, improve that interaction, so that students are aware of what is required in the industry and they start working on those skills and come out of
Right.
all the theoretical
Absolutely.
concepts.
Sir, you did raise a very valid point about the curriculum. Now, Ma'am Alia, Zafar, we've noticed that from the perspective of the industry, they keep talking about how the academia doesn't really prepare students to be a part of the industry, and we have to teach them on the job. What can universities do, or what can, and starting at the very basic level, because I know that if I'm at liberty to say this right now, by virtue of this forum, we're still teaching our primary school kids in these Islamabad model colleges and model schools about floppy disks, which have been obsolete since even before I was born. So, and we're still teaching them about that. What good comes out of this? What role does the industry need to play in terms of impacting or bringing about that change in the curriculum?
Right, it's a very, very interesting question, because this is where we have actually been in talk with a few of the universities as to how the end product that we receive, and we spend about at least a minimum of 6 to 7 months to have the person actually be productive. Essentially, what it means is that there is a bigger gap. And the gap is really not just about curriculum. It's the approach to curriculum. And I've been associated with some of the big universities we have as a sort of a visiting faculty as well. So I understand from both ends how it works. So the challenge here is that as we have any of the students in the universities and landing in the university, by that time their mind has been framed somewhat. So you have, and you may have, a well-informed mind, but do not necessarily have a well-formed mind. And there is a difference between the two. So a well-formed mind would be able to ask questions, would be able to analyze, would be able to draw conclusions. And one of the major challenges that I have seen in person in the universities, and then as an industry recruiter, is this lack of analytical ability, lack of having a well-formed mind. And essentially, it requires a lot more focus on discourse, on how to have a discourse, on how to actually be able to understand conflicting thoughts. So when we talk about diversity, one of the most important elements, part of our DNA at BOP, is diversity and inclusion, but it essentially also means diversity of thought. So if we cannot tolerate, understand, respond respectfully to diversity of thought, that actually travels into organizations and it creates a culture which would lack innovation, because we don't want to hear the other side of any story. So at the end of the day, the most important thing, I think, for the industry, if it's just that, create well-formed minds. And that's it. Curriculum, we can always, each industry will give them the direction, the soft skills. How do you actually completely change the mindset? That takes longer time, and it's already formed when we actually have these people, young people coming in.
Right. Very pertinent points made. Now, coming to Puruesh, I was reading this very interesting article yesterday in the Newsweek, and I came across, everyone has heard about future-ready skills, so critical thinking and analytical thinking, so on and so forth. And we were just talking about, and I was reading that a lot of job titles have changed, right? So we don't call people manager marketing anymore, manager sales. So it's customer success manager, customer relationship manager, and experience managers, chief experience officers. And then I dived into this a bit further, and I said, what do you think are going to be the hottest jobs of 2040? And I was reading online, and there's jobs like virtual store manager, robot mediator, drone traffic controller, augmented reality designer. Now that's the kind of future that we're looking at, and we know, Puruesh, that you have been, even in your papers, constantly, even in the one about anticipating 2027, spoken about the future. What does the future look like for us, especially in terms of the job market or sustainability of jobs?
So now that you've started, so now that you've mentioned, like a lot of my work, that's correct. A lot of my work has been on foresight and futures thinking, with a particular focus on Pakistan. One of the reason I'm here, so why not? The work that you mentioned, the Anticipation 2027, was one of the inaugural report. We want to test where Pakistan is moving in the next 10 years. And there we did factor in the sort of R&D investment as per the GDP that the government is making. But also at the same time, we were looking at the figures of unemployment. So as a relationship, so from a mind of a futures thinker, if you look into the relationship between the R&D investment and the unemployment, the gap between it is too wide. And as we move forward in the next 10 years, it still remains too wide. So there is a growing unemployment, and there is in fact a threat of growing unemployment, and also alongside not much is happening in research or innovation. So when you see that happening, you don't have many work opportunities sort of created. However, having said that, I was once sitting with one of my friends who works at Universal Services Fund, and he did mention at what degree they're moving in terms of digitalization of Pakistan and how they're connecting the remotest part of Pakistan. Now, when you're connecting the remotest part of Pakistan, you will see the culture and the values that they will bring into your way of thinking. So and how you connect these people, you'll see a change in language. Like you mentioned, I mean, there are so many of my friends that are called like their director of inclusiveness, their director for diversity. And as I mentioned, I mean, so there is a chief innovation officer. So when you see all these changes that have happened, and they're not happened in the last 2-3 years, they've been happening since the last 15 years. We've seen how organizations have changed the language that they use in terms of how they're providing employment opportunities. Now, why do they do that? As in how you frame, and Alia mentioned a very good point that there is a mind which has not been formed. And I think that is one of the critical assets that we need to understand, that how do you convert that? How do you get from a predominantly a very fixated mindset to an open mindset? And I think that's where, and not to be controversial, the more open your government is, the more of such features you're going to see in your society. The more closed your government is, the more features you're going to see in the society. So we need to understand that in the next 15 or 20 odd years, do we want to become an open society, or would we want to become a closed society? And that would really pretty much determine the sort of employment opportunities that we're going to create.
Right. Thank you for giving us that beautiful insight into the future. Ladies and gentlemen, in the interest of time, I'm going to remind you all to keep the answers brief. And starting with Mr. Azhar Nawaz, let's take his ending comments and your take home from this session.
So I think this was a great session, and we had very insightful comments and thoughts. Certainly there was discussion that our post-pandemic, the future of work is really different now. And I see that the changes are already coming, and people who didn't accept this work from home concept, I think they are now embracing that. And there's a lot of flexibility and the millennials, they're working from home and working at different times, and they're only focused on the objectives rather than doing this 9 to 5 work. So the way we are, the work environment and future of work is changing. In terms of the topic, coming back to the topic, I think what my takeaway would be that moving forward, I personally will try and do more interaction with academia, try to get involved and try to give something back from my experience to them. That is something which I think personally I will do. Similarly, the points which were mentioned by Zouhair in around in terms of soft skills and others. So I feel that once we hire people from academia, when they come in, we before they become productive, as Alia said, she said about 7 to 8 months. I think it's even more before they become productive. We need to spend a lot of time and energy and resources on them. So if we start doing that at an earlier stage, in a long term, industries will benefit. So industry needs to come forward and bring this research funding, introduce research fellowship, and collaborate with universities to introduce internship programs and all
Right.
that. I think moving forward, I'll do this. Take away from this session would be that I'll do this personally and also try to
Right.
introduce
Thank
in
you.
the organization.
Sorry, but in the interest of time, we have to move on to the next speaker. Ms. Alia, you've given a lot of advice to the academia during this session. Now, what would, and in your ending comments, what would your advice be to other industry professionals and C-level professionals that are watching us today?
Very simple, I think. First, of course, the future lies in hybrid work environments. So we need to start working on it right now. Second thing that we really need to work on is the culture. It's really all about how we connect with people and how we connect with work. And only then we can actually go towards any kind of innovation. And the third thing is when we talk about ideas, or when we talk about research, or we talk about innovation, or marketability, or impact, all these components, all 5, 6 of them, actually connect both with the industry and with the academia. So both of us need to have the same focus that when we're looking at an idea, eventually it has to have an impact. And when we are as an industry looking at it, of course we will do, but the same thing has to go with the industry. So both academia and industry, the linkage comes together if both of us look at it from the same dimension.
Right. Thank you very much, Ms. Alia. Puruesh, now to you. We've gotten advice for the academia, we've gotten the advice for the industry. Now the advice for the policy makers as you're ending.
I think they need to upgrade their skill sets. So while we're imparting all of this thinking to the academia and the industry, there has to be, even at the National Assembly or the Senate, there has to be an upgradation of how they think. Now, a lot of the politicians or your policymaker or your bureaucracy are pretty much jo unhone kaha na floppy disk wali cheez. If you go and visit the offices, it's the floppy disk you'll see. So we have to understand, in order for ye jo cut paste job hoti hai na policy making mein, I don't think that will be sustainable. And in response to your earlier question, like, will work be sustainable? It can only be sustainable if your policymaker is innovative enough to think beyond the confines of his or her constituencies. So I think the training and the capacity building has to happen there rather than elsewhere in a much more effective and efficient manner.
Thank you very much. That was indeed insightful. And Zouhair Saab, I'm going to ask you to give the last comments, but in your case, it's not advice for the industry, or not advice for the universities or the schools or the policymakers, but what would your advice be to the students who are watching us today?
Look, I think I'll again, the issue that we continue to, I think, face, and again, I'm going to try and bring in years of experience from other countries that I've worked in. We tend to focus, and I'm on so many WhatsApp groups every day, Puruesh is on some of them as well, and we tend to just focus on what we can't do or what the government cannot do. My view, and has been throughout my life, is that we need to change what we can around us. whether we are students, we are academia, we are industry or policymakers. And again, without being disparaging, to try and get the policymakers, to quote, what has been said, from the floppy disk to where we are today, is going to be a very long expectation. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen day after. But what we can do, what the luxury that we have as each of us as individuals and those listening, is that we try always to, eat the whole elephant at the same time. The only way to eat an elephant is slice by slice. Okay, I don't know how it tastes, but it's slice by slice. And the best way to do that is to try and influence the areas that we have around us, each of us, whether that's in academia, whether it's in industry, or as students. If you can make yourself that much better and those around you that much better, I think the whole thing adds up to a huge wave. वो कहते हैं कतरा कतरा दरिया बनता है, and that's how we need to do it. Because if we continue to say कि जी उसने नहीं किया और हमने नहीं किया, and we're still waiting for someone else to do it, it won't happen. It never has in life for anybody. All we can do is grab the opportunity right now and say we will do it ourselves. And if we infect the same attitude to our brothers and sisters, our friends, the neighborhood, that's where it starts. You need to light that fire in that area so that ultimately it all becomes the big thing that we are all wishing and hoping for.
Thank you very much.
That's the only way to do it. That's the only way to do it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zouhair, and everyone that's watching us right now. Ladies and gentlemen, we're short on time. I know you have a lot of questions for our panelists. If you want to learn more about who they are and what they do, the kind of work that they've been involved in, we've shared some links in the description. Please keep us updated with your comments and feedback. We will try and get you individual sessions with all of them on CXO Global TV. And upon an ending note, well, I'm going to say this. In the words of Abraham Lincoln, and I quote, "The best way to predict the future is to create it," unquote. So let's work on creating that future and making it the one that we all desire. Thank you very much for your time, and stay